Welcome. It is absolutely wonderful to have you all in person, on campus, in this wonderful space to celebrate our first annual Bristol in Conversation event this evening. For those of you who don't know me yet, I'm Evelyn Welch. I am the Vice-Chancellor and President of this amazing university. What a privilege. I'd like to start by thanking our friends in the Special Collections for pulling together the images that you've just been looking at on the screen. These incredible images are part of the Wild Film Archive, and a grant from the Wellcome Trust enabled comprehensive cataloguing of this remarkable collection, and it contains some of the world's most pioneering wildlife films. Part of this archive, the Wildlife Filmmaking Oral Histories collection, has recently been added to the UNESCO Memory of the World programme, and we're very pleased, honoured and grateful to have been able to share a small sample of this with you tonight. Now, I joined the university last autumn, and since then I've discovered that one of the many privileges of this role is the opportunity to meet and to get to know you, Bristol's wonderful alumni community, now over 260,000 strong and spread over almost 200 countries. I've only managed to get to about 3 countries so far, but I look forward to getting to the other 197 by the time I finish. And I'm delighted to welcome so many Bristol alumni here tonight, and indeed the many friends of the university who also join us both in person and online. And I'd like to welcome and thank the members of our various alumni groups who've joined us this evening, including our dedicated volunteers, our Alumni Association Committee, and board members from the University of Bristol Foundation in the US, and a special mention to the chair of the foundation, Una Ryan, who is here with us tonight from San Francisco. Una, thank you so much for everything you do. She's there in the bright pink. Don't miss her. Do make sure that you have a chance to talk to her this evening. So we're immensely proud of the things that our alumni go on to do, and tonight's panelists are no exception. We're fortunate to have with us 3 esteemed alumni in the wildlife filmmaking conservation field. Our outstanding panelists work at the crossroads of media and conservation, using documentary filmmaking as a tool to inspire the public and create change. And the theme of the discussion centres on our natural world, and will focus on our rapidly changing ecosystem and the ways in which each of our panelists hopes to educate others and protect our precious planet. Now, as many of you know, Bristol was the first university in the UK to declare a climate emergency in 2019, reaffirming our strong and positive commitment to take action on climate change. And a year later, we completely divested from all investments in fossil fuel companies. And sustainability, in every sense of the word, is central to our ongoing vision and strategy for the university. And we're committed to making it a core competence of the education we provide, by embedding it in our curriculum and developing initiatives like the Student Sustainability Champions and so much more. So we're honoured to be here tonight sharing knowledge and ideas on this most vital of topics, not just for us today, but for future generations to come. The university's Cabot Institute for the Environment is at the forefront of world-leading research into environmental challenges, and expert academics provide advice and guidance to decision makers on international, national and local level. And the Institute's 600 experts work to protect our environment and identify ways of living better with our changing planet. And we're fortunate to have one of those academics with us here this evening, Professor Daniela Schmidt, who will be facilitating the panel discussion. Professor Schmidt is a professor at the School of Earth Science at the University of Bristol. She was a coordinating lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Working Group 2 Assessment for Europe. Her research focuses on assessing past climate change as well as understanding modern processes to better assess risk, impact, and the potential for ecosystem adaptation. Now, I'm going to show you a 1-minute video as an example of a recent project that Daniela Schmidt is co-leading called Waves for Change. Waves of Change brings together anthropology, climate science, and animation to engage young people in climate change research and inspire them to take positive climate action. In partnership with the heart of BS13, the Waves of Change team is working with students in Hartcliffe and Withywood. The area in Bristol is one of the most economically disadvantaged in the UK. And Daniela and her team are developing strategies to promote these children's engagement with the green and blue spaces to create a future that will be just and sustainable for them and for all. Please, let's take a look. So let's have a round of applause and Aardman, watch out! So thank you to Professor Schmidt and to Dr. Camilla Morelli for all their work on this brilliant project and with this brilliant organisation. Engaging the public and specific young people with nature is of vital importance and something I expect our panel will dive into a bit deeper this evening. But before we begin, I did want to let you know that unfortunately Dr. Paula Kahumba has had a change of schedule and is unable to be with her this evening. We're sad to miss her, but look forward to an excellent discussion. So I know that this panel will provide us with a thought-provoking look at the ways in which we can take individual and collective action to ensure a better tomorrow for our planet, for our people, for our future. So without further ado, Daniela, I'll hand over to you. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you very much for joining us and for being here. For those of you who watched Springwatch this week, you understand why Gillian was a little bit late.
Yeah, my apologies.
Yeah. And I'm really delighted that you could come and talk to us today. My first question is trying to find out a little bit of where you started. So how did your time at Bristol shape the future of your careers?
Mike, would you like to start?
My life in Bristol started here at the university, and I was a very average student at school. My best friend is in the audience here, and he will attest. We used to sit at the back and avoid the teacher's glare because we were definitely not great students. But I was very fortunate. I managed to get a place here at Bristol University, and it absolutely changed my life. In a way that opened my eyes to the wonders of nature. I was interested in biology, but I discovered natural history here. I had fantastic tutors, including Professor Bob Savage, who Daniela says she remembers or knows of. And the inspiration that brought completely made me decide that's what I wanted to be. I wanted to be some kind of biologist, some kind of natural historian. But at the same time, I'd also been quite interested in television and films. And I started to make little films while I was a student. And I was fortunate enough to get a good degree and then go and do a doctorate, and where I was also encouraged to make films. And from that point on, I gave up the academic career quite quickly and decided I would be a filmmaker. But it all started here in 1976 in Bristol. So thank you, Bristol, and thank you, Bristol University.
like Mike. I did biology. I came here in '92.
Don't rub it in.
Sorry. Well, that sounds like a long time ago now as well. So in '92, and actually interestingly, Paula, I know she's not here, but Paula, I didn't realize, because when I got to Bristol, I just assumed I was sort of trailblazing, but I stand corrected now. Paula was there before me. Yeah, so I kind of took a bit of a meandering path. I wasn't, and I probably still am the same. I never had a laser sharp focus about where I was going, what I was going to do with my life, what I wanted to be. I probably arrived at things more out of process of elimination. So I ended up doing a biology degree because I really wanted to do performing arts, but it seemed like it didn't feel like a sensible way to, well, essentially spend my mum's money. I thought I better do something that I will get a job at the end of it, and it had an ology, and I loved nature. I was very outdoorsy, so it sort of all added up, and I thought biology, that's what I could do. So university was, it was a mixed bag of having, I remember loving parasitology. I had a really, Dr. Richard Wall, was my supervisor. I did a lot of entomology, so I got really into the little things, the invertebrates, insects particularly. But also university was also about the friendships that I made. Mm-hmm. I'm still like my, really good friends with the people that, almost by happy accident ended up in halls of residence with. The very first day I remember sort of coming to register for my biology degree with a really good friend of mine, Stuart, who I'm going to be seeing soon anyway. And the fact that it was just this kind of fate that we ended up in the same halls of residence on the same course. And we pretty much sat next to each other all the way for 3 years. And yeah, so it was not just an experience about, the education side of things and the academic side of things. It was also the whole full spectrum experience of good friendships, solid friendships that were forged.
As it should be.
Yeah.
So you both have something in common by dedicating your lives and your careers to capturing wildlife on film and to talking to people about it. Why do you believe that television and television programs, and we had a bit of a chat about that earlier, on nature is so important? What can television programs on nature do what we can't do in other ways?
I think it's a big question, because I think if I had answered that question when I decided to try and get into natural history filmmaking, what I probably would have said then, so this is, late 90s by this point, early noughties, is that it was a way to share the wonder of nature. I still find it wondrous and mind-blowing, and I felt convinced that if I shared my passion and got people excited about all the weird and wonderful things that happen all the time around us, most of which we're oblivious to, like even the microbiomes in our bodies right now, the incredible sort of, on so many, the scale of it is just so mind-blowing. So for me, I felt like if I can share that feeling that I get when I start to think about how, like, it's like trying to imagine infinity. That's the way I describe my sort of feeling when I think about nature. It's like I can't actually express it. So I think, well, if I can get people close to that feeling, then they'll care. And when they care, then they'll want to change the way, we interact with this world around us. And, and it's natural and human. So I felt very convinced that was the reason why I was doing what I was doing. I think now it's more about access. Most people live in very nature-deprived environments. And so, it's actually just literally, if you don't see it on TV, you probably won't see it at all, which is quite a stark kind of reality that I think, for many people is what we live with now.
Yeah, we tend to forget that that in Europe, 60% of our people live in cities, and therefore discover nature in a very different way.
Yeah, well, I mean, more than half the human population in a few decades will be, living in urban environments, so worldwide. So that's, a very real thing to grapple with. And so I think I would be really sad if that's the only way people interact with nature. It can't replace it, but for now, I think that's the answer I'd give you. Sorry, it's a long answer. I'm going to keep my answer shorter.
No,
don't worry.
Gives me time to think. But the thing is, we're almost certainly going to say very similar things, I'm afraid. Sorry, audience. But I agree that the thing that I wanted to do and got excited and still get excited about is showing people the wonders of nature, and I particularly through the prism of the lens, because what the lens can do is show you things that the eye can't see. And I've always been fascinated with the sorts of photography that stretch the visual experience, so high speed, micro photography, time-lapse photography, visual effects photography, because that can bring to you an experience of the natural world that you can't get with your own eyes. Having said that, there is also, as you say, I think it's called experience extinction is a phrase that people are using, that people's experience of nature is becoming less and less and less and less. And that's partly because of living in a more urban life, urban world. But also I just think that there are other things to distract people. But fundamentally, we're only a few thousand years when we were part of the natural world. So I think it's deep still within us. And part of the job, I think, as a wildlife filmmaker is to rekindle that and show people, remind people of these connections we have with nature. And so that still drives when I think about a new project, because part of my job is to come up with the new project ideas, part of what I think about is what's an experience, what's a part of the natural world that people haven't seen or haven't experienced and they might enjoy experiencing and connecting with. I've just done this series called The Green Planet about plants, and we'll probably talk about that a bit later. But inevitably, I've done this now for nearly about 35 years, you can't help in your own experience of having seen things that you've witnessed in person, filming things, or filmed things that your colleagues have filmed, and seeing change that has happened to parts of the world, which is alarming. You see things that you were saying, well, I remember I was there 15, 20 years ago, and it looked completely different. And a crew go to the same place, and they see it, and it looks utterly, utterly different. And I've been fortunate, I've spent a lot of time working with David Attenborough, and he's done it for 70 years. And when I first used to go out with him, he used to say, we go somewhere, he said, well, of course, I remember this when it was, back in 1955 or whatever it was, and it was this, this, and this, and this. And I used to think, oh. And now here am I, same 35 years later, now I'm saying the same thing. Now expand that, as I say, by his life experience, and you do see a very, very sobering change. However, again, I think we might get to it. There are winds in the other direction, which I think give you there are some positivities that we I hope to think that sometimes by showing people some of these wonders, they do generate a love and a passion for these things and a care about them. And when you can then juxtapose that with the loss, it does stimulate action. Now that can be audience action, but sometimes it's interesting. It can stimulate kind of what would you call it, academic action or NGO action. Sometimes you get. You meet somebody in a location and they say, I watched Life on Earth when I was a teenager, and I saw this and I started to be interested in this particular place or this animal and realized that it was in trouble, and I've now dedicated my academic career to studying it and trying to save it. Or I run a NGO which does that. And that is incredibly gratifying, because you do feel that you have, by creating what is effectively entertainment, you are also having a role in driving some of these actions.
You talked about Green Planet already. You've been talking this week about buzzards and how well they've been doing in the UK now. How do you tell a story effectively on screen? How do you go from seeing an interesting storyline to making it into something which works visually, which works for people, to bring these things together?
Okay, so I mean, I've had an it's interesting to me, hopefully to other people, an interesting kind of journey through natural history filmmaking, in that I started behind the camera. I never intended to be in front of the camera when I set off on this journey. And my experience is that there's more editorial control from when you're behind the camera. So you have, so I started as a researcher, then worked my way sort of through assistant producer, got my first sort of directing, producing gig, and that's when I discovered I was pregnant with my son, who's now almost 17. So I never thought that being in front of the camera was, gave you full license to tell a story exactly the way you want to say it. So now my experience being a presenter in front of the camera is I appreciate the process that the team behind the camera have to go through to shape the kind of narrative. And what I feel I do, or what I can bring, is the way I see the story. So let's say with the buzzards, or actually maybe I'll talk about what we did today because that's fresh in my mind. So this morning we were filming on Anglesey with a population of red squirrels. I was interviewing the scientist who's done research there for the last 20 years, and it's brought that population back from like 4 squirrels to, you know, a really thriving, genetically diverse population now. And I think for me, when I was listening to his work, yes, the science is interesting and is important, but what was also equally exciting for me was the fact that that would not have been possible without community engagement. Mm-hmm. It would not have been possible without people understanding how the environment needed to be connected, so everyone's gardens and anyone who had any agency over the land that they live in, around or near, how they could shape that. So to me, if someone else had done it, it might have been, you know, a straight science story about, you know, a population that was experiencing a bottleneck in terms of their genetic diversity. They're becoming more and more inbred, and the population is becoming unhealthy and effectively dwindling down to extinction, local extinction. You know, to me, it was more than that. It was actually, well, there are people involved in this, and that's something that I feel passionately about, is trying to remind us that we are very much a part of this. We're embedded in it. We're not on top of it. We're not sort of presiding over this as much as it feels like we do. We are deeply embedded in a much bigger sort of matrix of life. And so, you know, for me, that's kind of when I get like animated about talking about a subject. And how effective that is, I almost kind of like, well, that's what I do, that's what I can offer, and I really hope it works, you know. So,
well, I think there's no one size fits all. I think that's the first thing to say. And what you're describing is, you know, quite I suppose you could say, a journalistic sort of part of the spectrum, although we're all journalists to some degree, I guess. But you know, if you look back sort of historically over the kind of the journey that natural history filmmaking has taken, it was originally quite reportage. It was just, here we go somewhere, we point a camera at, and we just show you what happened. It's very much about species. These are lions, these are wildebeest, these are giraffes. Occasionally you had the sort of weird, well, the outliers. You had people like Michaela and Armand Dennis who would do the personal safari, the human interest thing, which was, have you ever seen those films? You should watch them. They're a phenomenal piece of social history. They're extraordinary. And I think really that type of story, the natural history film, was pretty much the way until Life on Earth. And then when Life on Earth arrived, that was the sort of son of civilization and Ascent of Man. And I don't know if those of you can remember those shows. They completely changed the factual space of how stories were told about science, and one was about history, one was about the evolution of science, and they were these potpourris of a presenter, a very charismatic presenter, would take you around the world and show you these extraordinary examples and create a thesis. And then, of course, Attenborough took that with Life on Earth and effectively did that for the evolution of life. And that format is really still very much, although landmarks, if you watch a Planet Earth or a Blue Planet, that's still basically the format. The change, I would say, and how we tell stories now is not dissimilar to what you're saying. It's the human interest story equivalent of an animal. So rather than telling stories about lions or wildebeest, you're telling the story about a lion or a wildebeest. What's happening to that individual animal during that particular moment that you spend with it in your filming experience? And that the reason why I've always found that fascinating is that if you spend any time watching animals, you realize they are individuals and they have extraordinary characters. You know, if you watch lions, you get stupid ones, clever ones, sneaky ones, brave ones. You know, all the different gamuts of behavior. And George Adamson, I don't know if you have ever seen, he had a wonderful quote about watching lions, and he said exactly the same thing. So the storytelling and how you engage people is with that empathetic connection. You see in their lives, like your life reflected. And then you start to care about them. And I think if you care about something, inevitably you get more interested, and then you potentially, if you want to take it to the next level, which is about protecting them, you're more inclined to want to do something about protecting them. And that was taken to the sort of extreme in the series I did, and I've just seen Peter's over there, who worked with me on the green plant. That was our challenge. Could we do that? Could you empathize with a plant? And that was our aim, and I think we did. And that's why I think it was a success, because we told the story from individual plants' perspective, and then you care about that plant, that little seedling. Is it going to survive? Is it going to be beaten by all those other seedlings? No, come on, you can win.
You both alluded to the change in the environment. You know, the stories of the loss of an ecosystem or the loss of a species, of the successes. Climate change and biodiversity loss are now everywhere on the planet. You have travelled, I suspect, most parts of this planet if you jointly together. How have you experienced those changes firsthand, both in the UK as well as wider afield?
I've definitely seen a lot of changes. I think probably most people in this room, if asked the same question, would answer it in the way that I'm going to. So I'll probably just wind forward to kind of where we are now, and also kind of a slightly UK, maybe centric answer to that question, which is I only came to Britain to do my degree. So I arrived here at 18 years old in 1992. Everyone can work out my age now. I find it interesting to have, I spent my first 10 years in Kenya. My teenage years I lived in Austria because of my mum's work. She worked for the UN. And then I arrived here as a young adult, an emerging adult. And what I noticed about this country and subsequently is that it's an interesting, almost like, I almost kind of saw it as it's like an experiment. It's an island, so it's contained. And in a sense, when I really started to kind of dig into the story of the land here, I was like, wow, this is like a tired, overworked, like really deeply extracted country. Like I live in Cornwall now, and Cornwall's this beautiful tourist destination. Most people think of the beaches, but it's actually a post-industrial county. There's scars and still, toxic waste leaching out of old mines. So in a sense, when I call it an experiment, it's an interesting, maybe front runner of like a whole country that is now, and I would say this is what a lot of like conservationists and scientists I speak to and interview through the watches, feel that there's a slow tide, like the tide is turning, in the sense that there are now more and more projects about regenerating post-industrial landscapes, translocating species, reintroducing species, plants, animals, etc. And so it's almost like it's a snapshot of like, well, you've got this landscape that has now almost seen, I wouldn't want to say it's seen the worst, but it's definitely seen a lot, and how nature bounces back if it's given a chance, with some interventions or sometimes no intervention. There's some wonderful examples of landscapes rewilding because everyone just dropped the reins and said, let's leave it alone. So I think we can talk about loss a lot, but I think what I'm starting to feel is there's a need maybe to talk about, well, that there's an uptick. And literally the scientists I was speaking to today, interviewing Dr. Craig Shuttleworth, what he said, what we now need is the habitat and the political will to make this happen, because there's almost like it's percolating up this right around the country, this kind of sense of like, we need to fix this. And there are people trying and doing good work to do it, but it needs join up, it needs political will to really like make that happen and really make it take off. So it's a strange one. I don't like to sound hopeful just because it's a nice, warm, fluffy feeling. Sometimes that can be more damaging. But I do feel like we can start to change that narrative a little bit. And yes, there's been a lot of like catastrophic loss actually worldwide. But I think, you know, I genuinely think that there are little beacons of light out there where there's some really good examples of how nature will bounce back if it's given, you know, like I say, give nature an inch, she'll take a mile.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. You hear about with lots of countries, when rather childishly, or infantile, whatever, when I was about 30 odd, I thought to myself, right, I've always got to, every year, I've got to make sure I've got to travel to more countries than my age. And I got to 60 countries pretty quickly, so I thought, fine. I now need to go and travel to some more countries to keep myself above that age. But one of the first countries I went to was as a wildlife filmmaker was Madagascar, and I'd always wanted to go to Madagascar, partly because, of course, it was the great place that Attenborough went to for his zoo quest and all the rest of it. So anyway, I went to Madagascar, and I remember flying into Madagascar and looking out of the window, and I saw this massive river valley, and in the sea it was this bright red, almost the colour of your card there. I thought, what on earth is that? And it didn't dawn on me that this was erosion that had taken all this terra rossa soils, I think they're called, out into the ocean. I think, and I didn't think, what's causing this? Of course, it was massive deforestation. But anyway, I went to film a number of things there, but including my favourite animal, which is an indri. And I filmed these wonderful calls that indri make. And one of the things I wanted to do was show how amazing they are at moving through the forest, because they do this wonderful brachiating. They can almost like they fly through the forest. And the only way I could do it was everybody used to always keep the camera on the tripod. I thought, no, the way to do this is let's take this comes from having done obstock. Take the camera off the tripod, go handheld, and run through the forest as fast as you can. You get this lovely handheld feel of these indris leaping through the forest. Anyway, very happy with that. Planet Earth 2, 25, nearly 30 years later, we go back to Madagascar. I didn't go, but one of my colleagues went to film indri, and I'd always said this was one of the shots I was most proud of. Could we do it better? And she said, well, I'm going to try using cable dollies, where the camera is on a dolly and it flies, the camera itself then flies through the forest. And she came back with these absolutely wonderful shots, much better than the shots I got, and I was very pleased. Anyway, we were discussing it, and I said, it's so lovely to see that again. And it's such a beautiful forest there. And she said, that forest, there's none of it left, absolutely none of it left. We had to point the camera in one or two directions, and that was the only way we could get those shots, which is something perhaps we should bring up later, actually, about the veracity of that. But nevertheless, that forest had gone from being this extraordinary primary forest full of indri to a tiny little microcosm where these indri were only really surviving because they were being supported by the tourist industry. It was shocking. On the other scale, about the same time, about a year later, I went to a place called La Selva in Costa Rica, and it's a field station there, and the scientists there had just started to establish it, and it was surrounded by ranch land, farmland and cattle. And the scientists had decided to buy off these ranchers a huge strand of this ranch, and they had kicked the farm animals off, fenced it all up, and then said, we're just going to leave it and see what happens. Well, 33 years later, was back by coincidence with Attenborough. We stood in that very spot, and we thought, this is this place, isn't it? So we did a piece to camera, and if you watch Green Planet, he says, 30 years ago I was here, and everywhere was cattle. Scientists got rid of the cattle, fenced it off, let nature do its work, and then the camera paused back and said, look at it now. And it is the most beautiful, it's not primary forest, of course, but it's a wonderful, diverse forest, full of hummingbirds, full of frogs, so leave nature alone, and it'll do the job for you. It will recover. It has an amazing power to recover, but we need to give it the chance to do it.
You've both given examples of local community action, decision-making around conservation. Do you think that there's a change in the tide? Do you think there's a change in the perception of people that we are, there's been a lot of feeling doom and gloom around climate change and biodiversity loss, and that people now feel empowered to take action?
Not enough, I don't think. I mean, yes, a little bit. I think where the spikes are bigger, I'd say. You know, that people are, particularly biodiversity, it's interesting. You know, we talk a lot about climate change, of course that's a big issue, but biodiversity loss is the thing that's the thing that has hit me in the face in the last 5 years. It's the loss of diversity, which is one of the consequences of that. But I think that, because it's more tangible, I think people have got more attention to that. When you start talking about, we used to see this animal here, and we now no longer see it. It's a much more emotional thing for people to connect with, rather than slightly nebulous what climate change means to people. I think a lot of people don't really even, well, you were saying this earlier, they don't really even understand what an environment is. But they do understand. They used to see they used to see some bird in their garden. They now no longer see it. I think people do understand that. So that's potential catalyst.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm honest, I think I personally feel like I've spent too long believing that this was about educating people, and this was about, you know, getting people to sort of like, you know, call to arms and get everyone activated. I mean, there's nothing wrong if someone watches a program and comes away and thinks, I want to do something about that. That's brilliant. But I wonder whether the burden of responsibility is placed too much on just people who actually can only do so much. Like, I mean, I feel like that. You know, there's only so much I can do. And I think, you know, this may be sort of not controversial, but it's sort of slightly going against the grain. But what I think now, yes, you know, we can all do our bit, but, you know, this is really about kind of identifying the sections of society, the real actors in the whole population. There's 8 billion people on the planet. We can't all be equally responsible. We can't all be equally able to like have agency to make changes in lifestyle, in, you know, have an impact. So I think it's more about removing that sense of like, the only way to change this is to get this widespread public engagement. And if once everyone is educated to do better, then this will be better. I think it's actually more now about identifying like where, you know, I call it like gains per unit effort. Like if we're going to put all this effort into telling a story, can we make sure that we identify the real actors who can actually make the difference, rather than assuming that this is just a sort of homogenous, you know, mass of people that everyone's got to pitch in. So that's my kind of sense, and it's a difficult one to do. It's difficult to do because there's, you know,
sort of a pincer movement, I think. Yeah. You know, there is undoubtedly an impact that everybody can make, particularly in terms of what's the next word I'm going to say? In terms of consumption is what I was going to say. You know, and undoubtedly, that, you know, that's the challenge that this lifeboat planet faces. That there is too much consumption by this one species. But there are also, at the other end of the other side of this pincer, there are those that have their hands on the levers of power. And they in one tug, they can do 1,000 times more than we can, any of us, or 1,000,000 times more than any of us can do. Perhaps, you know, one of the potential levers we have is a little lever, which is that a lot of these people are in power because we either vote them into power, or we buy their products. And in that sense, we do have some power, because if we don't vote for them or vote for somebody else, or if we don't buy their products, then they may start to pull the lever in a way that might make the planet a better place. But that's probably what has to happen, frankly. It has to be done at a governmental, big business, farmer, all that kind of thing level. But as I say, it does filter down to...
Yes, definitely all of civic society.
Actually, there is, I mean, we were talking about plastic, you know, the blue planet, the so-called blue planet plastic effect. I don't know if you remember that, but... You know, and that had an impact for a while, and it was done through I think the reason why it was effective, because we've tried to make films, we've made dozens of films about the scourge of plastic as a pollutant and all the rest of it, and as a thing that damages the natural world in many ways. No impact whatsoever. And then the stars align in Blue Planet. Partly it was a massive series, a popular series, but also the stories that we told were about individuals, and it was a very direct connection. So effectively the story was a plastic Bic lighter, somebody throws it in the trash, it ends up in a long journey, ends up in the ocean, an albatross mother picks it up thinking it's a squid, feeds it to its chick, the chick chokes to death on it, and there's the mother sitting over a decomposing baby. And that's a direct, you can say, that chick died because somebody chucked a lighter, a Bic lighter, I shouldn't say Bic, in case I get sued. There are other lighters available.
Other lighters available.
Yeah. But anyway, you get the point. And it was incredibly powerful for that reason. And there was this huge sort of, and plastic straws. Do you remember the little seahorse that was on a cotton bud actually? But there was also plastic straws. And of course, it created this engagement, and lots of people and lots of changes happened. And I went to a talk, an event, the Biennale event, and everybody there was talking about plastic. And I had to shut on and talk about something else. And I felt really, really awful, because I felt like saying, yes, of course, plastic is bad, but guys, it's not the big story here. You know, there's but it was something that people get their hands on. And I suppose what we would hope to do in what we do is, can we find different ways of creating that plastic moment for 10 or 15, so you multiply it up, so that ultimately there are many, many plastic campaigns generated by some hard-hitting, but not in a ticking, telling off way, but in an emotionally empathetic way, when you see some animals and connected to their lives that you can relate to, which is what that did.
So I have this like, it's something that I've not had the time to really dig into. So just before the Glasgow COP, which is like 2 years ago now, isn't it? I was very, reading all the press, and I remember reading this article that was actually in Al Jazeera on their newsfeed, and it was about the thing that caught my attention was a graph about rising carbon emission and where we needed to be in order to stay beneath, or at least bend the curve towards not going past the 1.5, the magic number. And I was looking at it, and the way I read these two separate graphs was, well, we need to basically go back to where carbon emissions were in the early 90s, mid-90s, in order to achieve this aim. And I thought, it was the first time I'd love to know if I'm actually right, but anyway, let's just go with my fuzzy logic for a second. I actually thought to myself, well, if that is true, that's actually not a difficult sell for people, because I often hear people going, oh, we can't go back to living in the caves and dark ages and all this stuff. And I'm like, well, the 90s wasn't that bad, trust me.
That's great.
And there's also this archive, this living archive in sitcoms like Friends. We can actually watch these things and go, well, they didn't have mobile phones and they look quite happy. And life didn't look that bad, did it? And Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, whatever it is you wanted to watch. But I do sometimes wonder whether, this period, which, I often think, like my sort of lifetime has tracked some milestones in terms of environmental milestones. I was born just after the first Earth Rio summit. By the time I came to Bristol, I think it was the second big Rio summit. So there've been these milestones, and certainly since Bristol being at university here to now, my adult life has presided over some of the steepest curves in terms of environmental degradation. So whether it's plastic pollution, whether it's carbon emissions, whether it's water quality, you name it, pretty much everything. The one thing that's actually gotten better is the ozone hole, but that's a complicated story. So I often think wow, so we're talking about winding the clock back to the 90s, and what is it that's changed over that period? And that's the digital revolution. And I think, what Mike alluded to about consumption, that's what's changed. It's the ability, literally in a heartbeat, a one click, to buy a garment, buy an item of clothing, buy whatever you want, actually, and have it delivered to you in a day. And we talk about fluctuating baseline syndrome, which is this idea that you get used to the level of, absence of wildlife, absence of biodiversity. I think the same is true with how familiar we've become, or how used we've become to this idea that we should be able to just buy what we want when we want and have it delivered straight away. or, you know, that I can buy, you know, or I don't actually, but, you know, that one can buy an item of clothing, wear it once and throw it out. That's become normal. And I think, you know, certainly for anyone who's born like post the digital revolution, that is normal. And I think it's really hard to kind of shift that perception again. But, you know, like I said, for me, it's like, well, you know, if we could like sell it as, let's just go back to living like it was 1999, like, that's not that bad. I don't know.
But
so simple and reductive, but I think it would be an easier sell.
but telling those kind of, or bringing that kind of perspective to whatever you want to call them, wildlife films, natural films. I mean, these are challenging. I suppose slightly taking a detour, but the weight of this shouldn't just sit on the shoulders of wildlife filmmakers. You know, there's part of the job of wildlife filmmakers, I think, is to tell people about how wonderful the natural world is. And there's lots of other documentary makers, journalists who also can tell these stories. And I think the way to make them effective is the surprising perspective, the surprising mirror you hold to these interactions, these issues, because so much of so many people come to me and say, I want to work in naturalism because I want to make a conservation film. I say, great. So what do you mean? Silence. Because they don't really know what that means, because it means anything and nothing. And I think one of the things that the next generation of filmmakers need to think about is, how are we going to redefine what wildlife or what films about the natural world are? And how are they made, and how the story is told, and what are the focuses, and how are we going to present them? Is it going to be on televisions, or is it going to be on social media, or is it going to be on big screens, or is it going to be in holograms? I think it's a very, very, there's a little door in the media space that is opening, and I don't know what's behind it, but I think it's going to be very different from what we have today, the traditional media that we have today. And that's the opportunity, I think, for the next generation to try and think about, how can we make these stories? So the story you just told, you can make that 20 different ways, but at the moment, well, I say that, I can't think of 20 ways, but I'm sure there would be. And the trouble is, I think we can't think of enough variety of ways to do it, but that's the next challenge.
I think this is a good moment for us to, open the questions up to the audience, because you've talked about the future.
Yeah.
The future of filmmaking. We touched on lots of aspects, and we are inviting now wider questions from the audience to hear what you would like to hear from our alumni.
I said not in the front row.
We have got mics, but they might dip in and out, so bear with us.
I work in the tech field, and we work in mixed reality and virtual reality. Apple have just released their goggles that I'm sure everyone has seen. Do you think that technology like that is going to help bridge the gap between, I guess, humans and the natural world? Or do you think it's actually going to cause a bigger void?
Sorry, I'm just laughing because we both went at the same time. You first, Mike.
Well, I should, full disclosure, because I actually work, part of my job is I work for Apple, and I was involved in some of the content that's on those goggles. But I don't know the answer. I mean, the thing, I suppose what I would say is that the nightmare is that the experience of nature becomes one that is done through a virtual reality environment, which I say it's the nightmare. That may be very, very arrogant. That may be a wonderful thing to do. I don't know, for people who are unable to. But if that is the answer, that is, from my perspective and the experience I've had, that would be a tragic missing of the experience.
Yeah, so absolutely right. I think there's some, there's certain species, there's certain habitats that can't sustain everyone going to see it, definitely. So that has a role there, like this country, grey seals. I mean, Kenya, where I was born, where I grew up, some of the national parks there have, very busy basically. So to try and be, not to put people off, but I think for me, it's a really tough one. I just wish everything would slow down a bit. You know, the tech isn't bad. It's just that the rate of innovation is what I find troubling, because, you know, I mean, I know this is way out of my area of expertise, but certainly everything I read about AI it's just that it's the race to get there first between the different platforms that are rolling out different AI platforms. That's actually what's creating the risk. It's not necessarily that tech is bad. It's just that need to, you know, do it faster, do it quicker, more innovation, you know, the latest version, the latest upgrade, you know, and that's what troubles me more than anything. So I think, you know, it has the application is brilliant in the sense that, yes, it can bring experiences to people that either for, you know, in terms of accessibility can't get there, or that, you know, those environments themselves can't sustain everyone going to see it. But I worry for the same reason, you know, because there's also that sense, like, the tech comes at a cost as well, an environmental cost, you know, so the raw materials that are required to support this industry, support like the fact that I've got a phone, support the fact that, you know, I've got a microphone that's, you know, everything in here has an environmental cost. So if we could do it slower, that would be, I think that would give us time to take stock of the impacts it's having and where it's really necessary and how to use it in the right way and not just have this shotgun effect of this, get it out there and let's see what happens, which I think is kind of how the digital revolution works.
Jeff Goldblum says in Jurassic Park, I know we can, but should we? Can we do it, but should we do it?
Can I ask for some more questions?
Can I just quickly do one quick thing about that? I think there's no pun about this, but I think if it was augmenting the experience, I think that is, because going back to one of the very first questions, I still think there's a huge value in the education of the natural world is an amazing thing, and people love learning about it, finding out about it, and this potentially is an extraordinary way of learning and gathering knowledge, which, you know, there's something. I hope it's not too old-fashioned of you, but I think knowledge is exciting and fun and very rewarding, and I think it could be an amazing way of doing it, personally.
So I'll take a question here at the front, and then the lady in blue, further back.
I'm Sue Roberts, zoology 79. God! I wonder if you could tell. I've just spent 4 years as a district councillor, and watch you guys and worry about the political impact or lack of impact that is going on. You might talked about veracity, and David Attenborough has been criticised for making things look like they're better than they are.
Yeah.
And Gillian, Chris Packham has certainly got into trouble with his Grousemore activities. So what do you think? How far can you go? How constrained do you feel you are?
Wow.
Talk to me about politics.
So, I mean, I think, you know, I'm fascinated with, it's almost like I step back and just go, this is a mad old world we're living in now, because there are so many different worldviews. And I spend probably as much time on platforms that aren't really intended for me as an audience. So, you know, I will spend a lot of time on platforms that are probably viewed or called like right-wing platforms or climate denial platforms, because I'm actually really curious how it's possible for people to hold such opposing views. Like, you know, I sort of think, well, the simple question is the simple answer for me is to go and listen and find out, like, why people have such opposing views. So I think the way it feels to me, and Mike can sort of tell me if, you know, well, correct me, I guess, is that there is almost like, you know, there's a worldview for everyone now, you know, and if you stay in your echo chamber, that is your truth, and that is veracity. And so it's become like, you know, we're in the age of, you know, not being able to know what is true practically. So with that in mind, I think one of the things that I'm now sort of playing with in terms of, well, you know, if this isn't about like a debate of like, I need to convince everyone that I'm right and that, you know, I'm right and I'm a good person because I want to save the planet. I think I'm sort of more of a curious mind in the sense I'm like, well, there are 8 billion people on the planet. We are never all going to agree. So what is the plan for that, right? We might be really right about climate change, but what is the plan for a future where not everyone believes it? Rather than spending time trying to change minds, like what is the plan for that? And, you know, honestly, if I had the answer, then I probably should be a world leader. But I don't know what the answer is. World domination next, but not now. No, but, you know, so, and what I sort of think is that this is actually a failure of leadership, widespread across the board. And it's not a left or right failure. It's a complete failure of leadership. One of my favorite quotes from Nelson Mandela's autobiography is he describes as, in the first part of the book, when he's still a young boy, sitting in on one of the very last council meetings that was had. And he described the Zulu king as being the last of the great leaders. And he said the qualities of a great leader is a person that can keep their people together in times of hardship. And I look at what's happened to pretty much every country on the planet since COVID, and that is not what we've had at all. So for me, that's my question now is, it's not about truth, it's not about changing minds, it's not about like who's right or wrong. It's like, what's the plan for a future where we're not all going to agree, but we all need to live together?
The comment you make about echo chambering absolutely is the real concern. That's just why I'm such an advocate of public service broadcasting, because I think it's anti echo chambers. That's what public service broadcasting doesn't do if it's done well. And I think there is a legitimate criticism that some representations of the natural world on television are sometimes presented as more pristine or more perfect than perhaps they were if you swung the camera through 180 degrees. But I think again that the what was it Attenborough's, what's the quote from Attenborough? There's something about him. There's a quote, isn't there? Something, but that makes a headline. It's a very simplistic, very kind of unnuanced, and the thing is that something like I do work for the BBC, and the BBC makes programs for transmitting on the BBC. The BBC production makes it, and that's a portfolio. And there are your Planet Earths, but there's also Springwatchers. There is children's programs. There's conservation shows, which are more journalistic or more current affairs. And all of those programs give you a range of the arguments and the range of the experience. And so we can't make everybody watch all of them, but that is the role of public service broadcasting. It is to offer people as many different perspectives as they can. And I think historically we've been pretty reasonably good at that. Inevitably, if you only watch one of them, you could be critical and say, well, that's a single view. But as I say, if you watch the whole range, I think it's reasonably balanced.
Thank you.
Tim Davie would say it is.
There was the lady in blue at the back.
I studied zoology in 2000 here, and it was actually Bristol that inspired me to go on and do my PhD, because actually, Dr Gunton, it was similar to yourself in that it was the perspective of animals themselves that I found interesting. So I studied the visual systems of animals. So I went on to do my PhD in Australia on coral reef fish and studied how they see the world through their visual systems and how the colours they see affect their behaviour, that kind of thing. So from that, have you ever created a series where you actually objectively look at the way the animals see the world through their eyes effectively? So, for example, fish can see UV, we can't. So designing experiments for them was a challenge. So could you design a sort of series to look at the way that animals actually see what they're looking at and how they interact with the world, and therefore when the world changes, how that changes how they see it as well?
That's an idea for series
Yeah,
moment,
well,
isn't it?
Two of my colleagues are here, and they might be able to help me out here. But I mean, interestingly, in the history of wildlife, these things go in sort of fashions and waves. And there was a series called Super Sense, which did largely what you describe, and that was very successful 20 odd years ago. And then there have been others that have taken that approach as well. Interestingly enough, they've fallen out of favour at the moment, and that's because they're quite conceptual. And I don't know what it is, but audiences, if you watch mainstream linear television, BBC One or ITV, it's basically drama channels. So people go to those for dramatic storylines. So if you're trying to make a factual program in that space, you only really can operate there if your content and your storytelling is of that dramatic form. Now, actually, I happen to think that's a very good way of telling stories because, as I was trying to say earlier, you understand the interactions, the social behaviour. You are empathetic about what's going on in their lives. Something that's a little bit more physiological, which is what you're describing. Personally, fascinating. Love to do it. It's getting, like anything, it's getting these things commissioned when the fashion is perhaps not for those. Now, 10 years' time, maybe you can go and make that. I'd certainly watch it.
Using AI.
Pete, what do you think? Is that am I right? Is there anything?
BBC did make a series called Animal Camera many years ago that looked at how animals saw the world through different parts of the optical spectrum.
Ah, there we go.
And there have been one-off programs called Through Animal Eyes, where how you see insects split up the image into different parts. But like you said, Mike, they always came across as being a bit conceptual, and they didn't serve the whole audience, it was perceived. And so the little sequences of how an insect can see ultraviolet light, what have you, seems to go to be in individual sequences within the main landmarks. Yeah. So they are hidden within bigger programs rather than a program that solely concentrates on that one area.
Daniela, I'm not sorry, I don't mean to be doing your job, but Stephen also is another.
I'm very happy for you to take over.
Who also is itching to say something about animal senses.
I'm glad that we have so many experts in the room, and the proximity to the BBC definitely helps with
No, they're both independent filmmakers.
We did actually make a series with David Attenborough called Animals, Life in Colour, and we filmed UV sequences for that. I don't know whether you saw that. And we actually spent quite a lot of time trying to film in UV, which is very, very difficult, actually, because there have been UV films done before, or sequences, as Peter was saying, but actually there's been very little research on UV in the broad range of the animal kingdom. We were finding that we had found fish, was one of those stories, and birds, but across the whole animal kingdom, the stories are quite narrow, but we did actually get that series off the ground. But coming back to what Mike was saying, it took over a year to get that series off the ground. When we were pitching it, we were told it's too conceptual. We went back and we said, look, this is going to be bloody beautiful. It's animals in colour. How is that conceptual? And I think commissioning editors do have a very narrow mindset. And for them, things that are outside of a habitat-based approach to things, which is very often what we see on TV, is a very difficult sell. But I do think there's a bit of a change, because what you find is that the BBC, they do very good habitat-based films, but what we find is, as I work for an independent company, is that people come to us and say, we've got habitat-based films, can we have something that's a little bit different? So I hope that in the future we can pitch ideas that fill in around the bigger blue planets and planet Earths and bring those kind of stories to the world, really.
I was going to say you might have to wait 15 years to do it, but now after that, maybe you only have to wait 5 years.
Well, I mean, my little very short anecdote to add to that is you might guess, I like little things, the sort of microscopic stuff. So for ages, I was like, how can we make soil sexy and soil and microbiology sexy? And nobody was interested. And then Kiss the Ground, which is this Netflix documentary about regenerative agriculture, have, like, at some point there was like in a microbiology lab and they go into like a shot of a Petri dish and the music starts up and it's the I believe in miracles, where you from, sexy thing. I was like, no, they did it. They figured out how to make soil sexy and it wasn't me. You know? But yeah, but that for me, the answer there was they pull that into the human story, and they managed to bring the focus on soil in terms of it underpins like human life and our relationship with it and the environment. So to me, sometimes it is maybe about like bringing a human element into that to be able to tell the story in the way that you say.
Imagination and determination. If you want to see the most extraordinary film about the most unlikely subject, on BBC 4 there was a film called Moss. And I saw it, it was reviewed in one of the Sunday papers and it said, it's brilliant. I thought, it can't be. Watch it, it's brilliant. So if you've got a wet Sunday afternoon, watch Moss.
Yeah, sorry about the singing.
It's very French. No, it's great. It's very French.
I'm really
that.
sorry, but I think this might be all we have time for. We travelled around the world and the British Isles. We talked about the importance in communities, in conservation. We talked about the different ways that you can make films and you engage people. And I hope that you enjoyed the discussion we've just had. I would like to thank you both, Gillian and Mike, for coming. I really appreciated that and the insights you've provided us with.
Pleasure.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.
So, can I just say thank you so much, Daniela, as well, for facilitating, but thank you to you both for giving up your evening. And I think it's just lovely to see the spread across the audience as well. And I know personally, I'm good friends with a number of people here who are also zoology graduates. There are a lot of you here this evening, and so please do take the time to connect. What an absolutely fascinating evening, though. Thank you so much. And I suppose one of those moments, where, Mike, when you were saying getting people to connect, I take my son to school every morning, and on the way to school we have a chat about what the day is, and he basically thinks that my job is to go around having lunch with people, because that's normally my answer of what I'm doing most days. And I was talking about this evening's event, and he was saying to me, he said, oh, so was that, are they the people that were involved in that programme? And we were talking about the first time you can remember having an emotional reaction to a programme. So for me, it was Sylvester McCoy's Doctor Who. And that's the first time that I remember in the 1980s being terrified. And I had an emotional reaction to that. Cyberman, exactly. For my son, who is just about to turn 11, his first memory of an emotional reaction to a programme was becoming absolutely emotionally invested in sea iguanas trying to run the gauntlet across the snakes. And he was 5 at that time. And that is the lasting memory, and that is his earliest memory of actually being that emotionally invested in a programme. But what that means is that he's growing up with that passion for the natural environment and for the living world. And I think that's what you're both and all of the work is actually giving us as well. So thank you so much for that. So it does seem such an appropriate topic as well for us to be talking about here this evening at University of Bristol. We're incredibly proud, as you heard from Evelyn at the outset as well, of the fact that we do have some truly outstanding scientists and some outstanding researchers across all disciplines, from environmental humanities right the way through the sciences, through engineering, who are really working on climate and the environment. And it's something that runs at the absolute core of Bristol, both the city and the place and the university as well. The Cabot Institute is at the forefront, and we are incredibly proud every time we hear about the impact that Cabot Institute is having around the world. We referenced COP26 earlier, but each and every single COP, when I hear from colleagues about the impact that they are having at that, it makes the world a difference. One of the most powerful things, though, as well, is the role that our alumni play in actually making that Cabot Institute work so well as well. Both as advocates, as champions, telling the story around the world of the work that is done at Bristol, not only in the Natural History Unit here in Bristol, but at the University of Bristol as well, and the difference that it's making. The other side of things is the philanthropic support that comes in for Cabot as well. So Cabot have something that previously was called the Cabot Innovation Fund, is now called the Cabot Seed Corn Fund. And that is driven by philanthropic support from our alumni, and it allows some truly remarkable projects to happen. The US Foundation have also supported a whole range of different initiatives bringing climate and health to life. And thank you to each and every one of those people who have supported that so far. And I would encourage all of you to go away and just find out some more information so that you can be an advocate and a champion for Cabot Institute as well. You also heard earlier about the fact that today has been about a whole range of different activities celebrating different aspects of our alumni community and the wonderful volunteers that keep people connected and keep different things happening all around the world. Now, what we would love is for all of you to keep engaged with the university, keep engaged with us, keep connected with us and Bristol. The easiest way for you to do that is our online platform, Bristol Connects. When you get the follow-up to this event, you'll find the details there. But we would love for you all to register and be active participants and users on Bristol Connects as well. What I'd love to see is a little subsection for all those working in the natural world in different guises and those zoology people who seem to be here in force this evening to create your own online community to share and exchange stories on there as well. But we would love you to be part of that network as well. So just before we head off to the next part of the evening, we are going to go across the road over to Senate House. You may remember that as the administrative heart of the university. It is now a thriving student hub, and there is a lovely space there which has room and space for us to have a drink, have something to eat, and to carry on the conversations across everybody here this evening. So please do take the time to join us. We'll be over there till at least 9 o'clock as well. Finally, I'd like to remind those of you, we have one of those wonderful events that is put on by our alumni volunteers is the Bristol Reunion Weekend, which is taking place on Friday the 14th to Sunday the 16th of July. And there is so much more happening over the course of that weekend. And if you'd like to find out more, please do take a chance to speak to colleagues who will be over the road this evening. So while we do have a drink and have something to eat and carry on the conversation, there are a number of stands, both from our different branches, also from the special collections, so the Wild Film Archive that you saw pictures of earlier on, from the sustainability side of the university as well, so you can hear more about that. Do also take time to talk to each and every one of those stands while you're there as well. Finally, really, I just want to say thank you. Thank you to all of you who have travelled here and have come to join us this evening. We are incredibly grateful for that. Thank you to everybody who has joined us online as well. And I know that the reach of this evening is reaching far beyond the walls of just Bristol here. So thank you so much for all of you. And finally, if I can conclude just with another thank you and a round of applause to Daniela, to Gillian, to Mike for a brilliant evening this evening. So thank you very much.